African people played a big part in developing the economy of South Carolina. Like other southern colonies, South Carolina was largely based on the plantation system. Crops required many people to work the land. In Virginia, they used indentured servants at first. But by the time of Carolina becoming a colony, there were not many people interested in that kind of work. They also tried using the native people as a workforce too. That did not work out too well either. Many settlers from Barbados had brought their slaves with them. These African people knew how to work the land. They also knew how to use cows and other animals. They even knew how to grow rice. Later on, more slaves would be brought in through the Middle Passage. Many of these slaves came from the west coast of Africa. They were often sold to plantation owners at auctions. Over time, a thriving trade began to occur between Carolina, Barbados, and England. As the demand for crops like indigo and rice increased, plantation owners imported more and more slaves through the port of Charleston. Slaves brought their culture with them. They had their own language. They had their own music. They did their own dances. They also did wood carving. They knew basket weaving. African songs could be heard as they worked the land. Many parts of their culture became common in Carolina. Foods such as yams became a part of the Southern diet. GULLAH was a spoken language. It represented a shared culture among Africans that grew along the coastal areas of South Carolina and Georgia, where there it is called Geechee. Many African languages came together to make new words. The GULLAH language was unique to the coasts. As early as 1698, people began to worry that there were too many slaves in the colonies. But slaves were very important to the success of the colony. Slaves now outnumbered whites in some places. This concerned people. One event really made people worry about the number of slaves in Carolina. The Stono Rebellion began near Charlestown. It began when a small group of slaves planned to escape to St. Augustine. St. Augustine was a Spanish colony in Florida. They knew they would be free there. So they killed 2 settlers, and they began their escape. They used drums to call other slaves to join them, but they never made it to Florida. Over the next few days, a number of both whites and slaves would be killed. After the Stono Rebellion, slave codes were strengthened by the Negro Act of 1740. Slaves were no longer allowed to gather in groups without white supervision. They were not allowed to learn to read or write. They were not allowed to carry guns. The Negro Act was all about controlling every aspect of a slave's life. It created harsher punishments for disobeying the law, but it also fined slave owners who were cruel to their slaves. But slave owners now had more control over the lives of their slaves. South Carolina had very few free African Americans. The state government said that owners could free their slaves if they chose to. Some slaves were freed upon the death of their owner. Some were freed for their years of faithful service. Some slave masters freed their slave mistresses and their children. However, these things were rare because slaves were so valuable. Some slaves were able to purchase their freedom. If they had a special talent or skill, they could be hired out and allowed to earn money, which they could then use to purchase their freedom. However, free blacks were required by law to leave South Carolina within 6 months or risk being enslaved and sold at auction. Very few free blacks lived in the South.